I'll just say, yes, the last thing. So we had gotten through like 4 of the commandments 2 weeks ago, pre-Easter. Do y'all remember which commandments we got through so far? All of the commandments were around God, about our relationship with God. So what are those first 4 commandments? I'm the Lord your God. No graven images. Thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. We're ending with thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. When you recall, I was saying how expansive it is in Judaism. This isn't just like how we should live our lives or good meditation. This is how we govern ourselves. This is civil law and religious law combined. And so how do the Jews today get all the laws? If you're Orthodox Jew or even conservative, or especially if you're ultra Orthodox, how do we get all these laws, right? They're all coming from Exodus and in some ways related back to their kind of interpretations of the 10 commandments. So things like thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain can relate to anything that profanes the name of God. So for instance, child sacrifice, around the time this was happening, child sacrifice was fairly common in Gehenna, right? In the valley of Gehenna. So right outside Jerusalem, that's where they would sacrifice to Moloch. But you'd sacrifice it to the name of Moloch or under the name of Moloch. Well, that would be profaning the name of the Lord, because there is no Moloch, there is no other God except the Lord our God. So we're going through like this whole list. But I'll just say the final thing. There is an accounting. You know, this is from Matthew. Jesus says, but I say to you that every idle word men may speak, they will give account to it on the day of judgment. For by your words you'll be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. That Jesus seems to imply it does matter what we say and how we use our words, how we speak to one another. And right now I'm thinking about like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Marjorie Taylor Greene is on trial right now. Y'all like watching this in the news because she was like participant in like January 6th. So they're asking her all these questions like, hey, did you say this thing that we have video of you saying? Did you say this thing that we have like copies of you saying on like Twitter? And she's saying, well, I don't know. I don't remember it. And it seems like we live in an age, not just for her, but we live in an age kind of broadly where politicians especially speak without consequence, where they're just saying stuff all the time. And then all of a sudden it has consequence, like there's an insurrection. You say, well, you were at a rally telling people, follow me to the Capitol. You're saying, let's have a revolution. Let's have 1776. Let's storm the Capitol. Those words have consequences in a very real way. And also in kind of the strange universe where politicians seem to be above accountability, where they say, I didn't say that. You know, Kevin McCarthy this week, not to pick on Republicans, but it's a unique week for them. Kevin McCarthy, who said like, oh, I never said that about Trump. I never said that. And then they play like video of him saying that. I'm like, well, it does awfully sound like you on a call that you were having, you know. But Jesus puts it down. As Christians, we hold ourselves to a higher standard. We don't hold ourselves to the standard of politicians. We hold ourselves to the standards of Christ. And our words have meaning, our words have power. As a matter of fact, we call Jesus the Word. And so we should use our words very intentionally and thoughtfully. Each one of these commandments, right, is the greatest of something, the greatest responsibility, the greatest observance, the greatest day is the Sabbath day. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. On the 7th day you shall rest. I think we talked about the Sabbath 2 weeks ago. This is the one that we all virtually break all the time. And, you know, I was saying last week, there's no discrimination in God's eyes between, there's no value of this is better than this. Thou shalt not murder has no greater weight than thou shalt observe the Sabbath. These are all kind of linear. Observing the Sabbath, not murdering, are equal in the eyes of the commandments of God. And the Sabbath isn't this punishment. It's not this thing meant to be hurtful, meant to be breaking us down or breaking our will. It's not to like hold back our work ethic, but that we need rest, that our bodies need rest, that our lives need rest. There's like a mental health crisis in the world today, especially with youth. In part, they think, you know, studies will go on for the next 10 years and we'll have to go back in time and see. But in part, they say social media is a big factor in the mental health crisis. But there's no time for kids to stop. So you're going through puberty, your body's going through all these terrible experiences, everything's changing, your brain is exploding in 2000 stars. You don't know how to handle it, but then you get on social media and you're just getting bombarded all the time. There's no time to unplug, there's no time to rest, there's no time to just be a child or to be still, right? And as adults, children teach us on a small scale how to sin, and as adults, we get better at it. So then as adults, the first thing you do on a Sunday morning, you pull out your phone, you start typing emails. The first thing you do is you start going back to work on our day of rest, right? And then you can have it on your phone, on your watch. You can have it let's just have it plugged into your heart so that your heart defibrillator gives you a jolt every time you have an email, right? Where it's just incessant. And yet this is one of the divine commandments. God said, I myself rested on the seventh day. I'm modeling for you a way of life that you need rest. One of the great crises in America is lack of sleep. Sleep, the most beautiful of all things. It's oh, I can't wait to go to bed. And we have such terrible experience sleeping, right? How much we spend on sleep apnea, how much we spend on meditation apps, on all kinds of prescriptions just to get to sleep. During the Industrial Revolution, the whole idea was machines are going to make our lives easier. We're going to work less. And then in the information revolution, the information age that we're in now, so these computers are going to make our lives so much better, so much easier. We're not going to have to go in and be at the office 12 hours a day. It's no, now we can be at the office 24 hours a day. Now we never have to stop. This is the one we violate all the time. Thou shalt observe the Sabbath. There's something to that. It's related to this word cease or to stop. The Sabbath is not just about our need to rest. It's most importantly about our relationship with God. In resting and refreshing, it gives us time to turn back to the things that are most important. It turns us back to God. It's not meant that we need to come to church morning, noon, and night on Sunday, spend the whole dang day in church, although I do, and you could as well. Lou does, and you should. But it's about taking that time to be in nature, to be at peace, to be at home, to be at rest, that tunes us back into creation itself. It tunes us back into God's good work. In the biblical view, unless it's necessary for survival, people who choose to work 7 days a week are essentially slaves. And Jesus says, I've come to set the prisoners free. I've come to give you freedom. And yet we plug ourselves into the matrix, right? It's plug me back in. That I can work all the time. That I never have to stop. This isn't what God intends for us. It's also a commandment granted to animals, that your animals are supposed to take a day of rest, that you're not supposed to plow the field because your ox also gets the Sabbath. Creation itself hangs back. And gosh, what a different world it would live in if we said we're only going to pollute the earth 6 days a week. And 1 day a week, we're going to shut down plants. We're going to shut down industry. We're going to shut down manufacturing. What impact would that be? They said around the world during that first couple of weeks of when the world shut down, they said there were cities in India that where you could see a mountain range for the first time in 40 years because they shut down all the power plants, they shut down all the manufacturing plants, and all the smog cleared. It's creation wants to cure itself. And it could if we would just stop, if we would just slow down a little bit. That animals have dignity. I don't subscribe necessarily to the worldview of God made us as the owners of all creation so we get to do with it as we will. But I believe he's made us as stewards of God's creation and stewards of animals. Where I'm fine hunting, I'm fine consuming animals, I'm fine butchering the animals myself if I had to. But to do it in a way that's respectful and meaningful and intentional, a way that's beautiful, in a way that is in stewardship with creation. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. So you can say a bad word if you want.
No. Why do you think?
Well, this is a philosophical question for everybody. Yeah.
We do.
Why don't we stop? Why do we have this insatiable need? And I would say maybe perhaps in part it's connected to culture. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily an innate human drive, where I'd say there might be some villages or some cultures where it's not. But I'd say maybe some Asian cultures, you go to Japan right now, and it's the work ethic of a Japanese businessman is a cultural thing. It's a cultural identity to work 12 hours a day. In America, we have this kind of, I think, one of the great lies that there's never enough. I think this is the great lie that the serpent tells Adam and Eve. But what is God holding back from you? What is God not giving you? Maybe there's not enough. There's this like, almost depression era fear that there's not going to be enough. Gail, if you have food that doesn't need heated, you can put it in here. We're going to serve out of here. So you can put stuff in here. Okay, perfect. There's also plugs in here. But all that to say, like the drive for more, the hunger for more, and also everything in American society is propelling us to do that. The more money you have, the better you are. The bigger the house you have, the more powerful you are. It's this reward system. It's the feedback loop. And so it's like the more you work, maybe that means you're a harder worker. I think we have a lie that hours equate to productivity, where like that is not true. I don't know about y'all's day, but like I have about like 3 incredibly productive hours in the morning, where in the morning I can do like 8 hours worth of work. And in the afternoon, I have like 2 extraordinarily unproductive hours. And it's like learning to balance that. Now I have some priest friends, they'll be like, oh yeah, I work like 10 hours a day or 12 hours a day. It's like, but are you effective 12 hours a day? Are you doing anything 12 hours a day? My sister's an engineer, so she's physically like inputting information. So the more time she's on her computer, the more information she's inputting as an engineer. Okay, but that's not true for all of us and for every sector of work. Not everything is the more hours, but that's the ethos in America, right? Hours in the office chair equal higher productivity. I think COVID's taught us it's not true. But also this idea of you pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Work hard, be successful, have all the good things of life. Work 30 years, grind it out endlessly, and then retire and then die. What a nice life. But what else thoughts do y'all have? I know Tom has some deep wisdom on this. Gosh, at the beginning of the pandemic, what did everybody say? This was amazing. It's like everyone slowed down. We weren't running around town. We weren't dropping our kids off at 15 different activities. We weren't racing to work. We weren't sitting in traffic. All of a sudden, it's like, damn, this is actually kind of humane. This is like actually pretty nice. Almost as if God wants us to do it like this all the time. Yeah. Then you can do the deep work, the healing work. Exactly. I think there's an addiction to work. And I think there's like, workaholism is grueling and it's painful. And I think it's part of our culture. It's part of what our culture tries to impress upon us.
One of the things that I like to tell myself is that I'm a human being, not a human doing. And I really like that. And at one point I fantasized, what if the disciples had come back to Jesus with their checklist? And Jesus said, okay, how many miracles did you perform? Okay, how many times did you walk on water? How many times did you cross the Jordan? And what if the disciples had to come back to Jesus with those kind of metrics, as opposed to, I've got the Holy Spirit moving in me and these people who are really energized. It's a totally different metric.
I just watched The Eyes of Tammy Faye. Have y'all seen The Eyes of Tammy Faye? It's great. It was so good. It's about Tammy Faye Baker and Jim Baker and about kind of this 1980s evangelical worldview. And they were all coming in through like broadcasting and television. And the idea is like more and more and more. Like we need more money to do more ministry, to reach more ears, to do more, to do more, to do more. And one of the things I like about St. Thomas is I feel like we intentionally choose a different worldview. In the Episcopal Church, in a way, like St. Stephen's is growing and growing and growing. And rather than saying we're just going to build a football field sized church, so we're going to plant St. Thomas. Rather than being endlessly large, we're going to then go out and plant St. Catherine's in Chelsea. And even when we expanded ourselves, we didn't expand our nave, where we said, we're okay not being the biggest church in the world. That's not our goal. More and more and more. Just like feeding this monster. And like in the movie, Eyes of Tammy Faye, you see them like feeding the monster until like the monster takes over, until like destroys everything. Jim Baker goes to jail. Turns out like it's not like a great ending, right? But say like, what is it to be a Christian where our goal is not just endless, more, bigger, more people, but to say to go deeper, to go richer, to go more profound, to go more community, and to be robust and big enough to do the ministry we want to do, right? To be able to afford the ministry and the building and all the good things. So I think it's like a countercultural worldview, like a countercultural mission that we have at St. Thomas, to be not like the rest of the world. That's all the fourth commandment. The fifth commandment, honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Why is this important? Why is this the first two series of commandments? The first series, relationship to God. Second series is relationship to God, to neighbors, to others. Why honor thy father and thy mother? Why is this the first one we get?
Because they're the ones that teach you.
They give you life. They bring you into the culture. They bring you into not just the culture, but the faith. Now, again, we live in a different culture than in the Near East, in Israel, right? Where family means something different. You maybe think more Asian kind of context, where our family is revered. So the grandmother doesn't get put into a home. The grandmother comes and lives with us. The generation lives upon generation. So in the Near East, in Israel, where you just build vertically, where your family's expanding, and so you just build another layer on top. So after several generations, you have a pretty tall house because everyone's kind of building upon everyone. Where the faith is passed through the lineage, right? It's passed from father to son, mother, daughter. It's passed through the parents. Abraham begets Isaac. Isaac begets Jacob. Jacob becomes Israel. And the land itself is tied to, the land is our inheritance. The land is being passed from generation to generation in this nuclear family. In ancient times, and even in some cultures today, deceased ancestors were honored. In Israel, the honor due to parents has a definitively covenant context and pertains to accepting and passing on the Torah. The Torah, the law, is coming from generation to generation. This is the first thing that God tells them after the Passover, as they're about to leave. As a matter of fact, before they cross the Red Sea, God stops everything and says, teach this to the future generations. Teach it from grandparent to grandchild, for all times. That's why if you went to Passover last week with any Jewish friends, they would invite the youngest child at the table to help tell the story, because we're passing it on. This is our responsibility to raise our children, and therefore it's their responsibility to also honor us, to heed our words in our instruction. It's the primary unit. I experienced this. My dad's side of the family was German-Irish. My mom's side of the family was all Italian. And I experienced this a lot more in the Italian side of the family, where everything was about the family. Now, the family's dysfunctional, it's broken, it's chaotic, it's like super obnoxious, but everything, all my grandfather ever cared about was like, it's the family, it's the family, it's the family. Not even the extended family. He was one of 10 children, right? Not even extending to all his brothers and sisters and thousands of, relatives in West Virginia. He's like, it's our nuclear family. This is the most important. And then when you become a parent, when you get married, you become a parent, and you have your children, you realize, you say, this is the most important now. It's no longer even my brothers and sisters. Like, my nuclear family becomes the most important. It's the primary unit of life. We're going to see this as we go through all these things. What is the great commandment that God gives again and again? The great commandment, the commandment, be fruitful and multiply. The great commandment is life. Life, and it comes through this family unit. The family is structured to bring people. What does God want? People. Why does God want people? What is the purpose of God's existence? The purpose of God is to be in relationship with us. So what is our purpose? is to be in relationship with God. How do we get in relationship with God? It's by being born, right? By being born and following Torah. We get Torah from our parents. So we honor our parents, we respect, we defer to our parents to learn from them so that we can be in relationship with God, because that's our purpose and God's purpose in us. Y'all, does that make sense? Jesus takes it to the next level, right? Where Jesus is confronted and he says, but who are my father? Who's my father and my mother? Who are my brothers and my sisters? Those that do the work of the Lord. So Jesus kind of, he doesn't, in this instance, contradict the Ten Commandments. He kind of expands it like a telescope. It says, yeah, but I want you to see more. It's not just the family unit we have here. It's the people who do the work of the Lord. And this was, I relate to this. Y'all here this morning maybe relate to this. But when I grew up, going to church was my extended family. The people in the pews in front of me, right? There's a professor, Ken and Elsie. He was a professor of botany at the university. The guy behind me, Leonard, he was a retired Episcopal clergy. I have one of his old clergy shirts I wear. It's like falling apart, like literally the seams are like just undoing themselves. But I'll wear it every once in a while. It's a little tight. He was skinnier than I am. But I wear it just to feel, I washed it, but I'll wear it just to feel like that connection. These are the people that raised me. I can think there's a woman from Bessemer, Alabama. She was born in Fairfield, named Betty Guthrie, who was a grandmother in my life. It was this larger extended family. And I think we provide that at St. Thomas too. Where I bring my children, my daughter, Catherine, was born at St. Thomas after I'd been here for about a year. That Catherine has never not known St. Thomas. You people are the ones that help raise Catherine. Like today, she's by herself. And so I'm not, I might see her, or I might just meet her up in worship, where she might just be there with some family that's taken her and put her in the pew, right? Where we raise up our family together. So Jesus expands it. Who is my father and my mother? The ones who do the work of the Lord. We could talk about this for a whole class. Thou shalt not murder. Why is this significant? You're taking life. You're taking life. You're taking life. So does that mean there won't be any murder in the rest of the Bible? Does that mean there's no capital murder in the rest of the book of Exodus? Well, why should we not murder? Generally, we can agree that it's bad. I think across most societies, we all ignore, take the Lord's name in vain, we ignore the Sabbath, we ignore lots of things. Honor thy father and mother, we treat that loosely. But across society, people can generally say murdering's bad. Like, not a great way to exist. We're having a problem with it. It's not universal, right? We see Vladimir Putin not just murdering Ukrainians, not just waging war for some unknown reason, killing his own people, like his own generals who he's recalling. And either there are a lot of generals that are disappearing. There are generals who are dying on the battlefield. There are generals and top military officials around the Kremlin who are just disappearing. There are some who are being arrested. It's like he's just purging all of society, that life has no value. As Christians, right, we say we're made in God's image. Not just as Christians, as people of the Abrahamic faith, right? We'll go back, Jews and Muslims are going to say the same thing. We're made in the very image of God. What is the most precious thing God gives? Is life. Life itself is holy. Life is sacred. Life is the blessing. It's the blessing that God gives us. What can we offer to the rest of the world is to go forth and multiply. Do you want to share God's blessing? Then go have children. We are the peak of God's creation, right? We're not the accidental bystanders. We're not like part of the creation. We're the peak of it. He creates man, male and female alike in his image, and then God rests. So this is the height of all creation. The ones who can think and who can desire God as much as God desires us. And therefore, it's meant to be in that relationship. That when is God upset? He's upset when they're hiding from him. He's like walking in the garden and Adam and Eve are ashamed. He said, it's not that you ate the fruit and disobeyed me so much that you're ashamed to be with me. We're no longer able to coexist fully in relationship. What does God desire of you? I always say, I should love just to to love mercy, to do justice, and to walk humbly before your God. But it's that walk humbly before our God, to walk with humility, to walk with God. That's what God desires. And when we live here on earth, as we're on our walk with God, what can we do? We can love mercy so much that like it is our way of life. We can do justice, that everything we do, all of our movement, all of our action, all of our work is bringing God's justice into the world. What's your purpose? What is your purpose? It's to walk with God. Gail. Yeah. If you don't love your neighbor, you don't love God. So how do we love our neighbor? It's through justice and mercy. Most races from the most ancient times to present have prohibited murder and punished it. But let's talk about the nuance between to kill and to murder. Murder versus taking a life, right? We see murder first thing in the Bible. First thing that happens, Cain kills Abel. Like the very first, like Adam and Eve, they get kicked out of the garden. The very first thing, there's murder. Murder is an act of uncreation. If we are God's ultimate peak of creation, murder is destroying God's creation. Jacob's sons, right? We see Jacob's sons go and like murder a whole village of people. Like murder enters early. By the time Noah is there, right? We're like only like 4 chapters into Genesis, and there's so much murder, there's so much kind of devastation in the world that God says, I'm going to unleash the waters of chaos. You know what? Fold it all up, fold up everything in the blanket. We're going home. Like everyone's murdering each other, everyone's destroying creation. Well, but then we see other examples that aren't, these are to be highlighted. These are the good examples of murder, of taking life, right? Gideon and his army marching against the Philistines. Gideon's army being the righteous army, fighting for the land and the life of the Israelites. We see this in the wars against nations, invading nations and inhabiting nations, nations like the Canaanites who are already there as the Israelites are coming into the land. We see people dying after touching the ark of the Lord. This goes back to the prohibition to number 3, thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain, because the ark is sacred and holy. I don't know exactly why, but this is like what the rabbis taught. Somehow by touching the Ark of the Covenant, God says, this, my holy presence dwells there. My Holy Spirit is on the Ark of the Covenant. So by not following my instruction, you're profaning my word, you're profaning my name. So you see, like they've recaptured the Ark of the Covenant and they put it on this trailer, this wagon, and like they're going back to Jerusalem. It starts to slip off, and there's a guy walking beside it, and he catches it and readjusts it so it doesn't fall on the ground, and he dies immediately. You should observe the 3rd commandment, thou shalt take. But anyway, that's not seen as bad in the Old Testament because he did something wrong. So he has voided his life. He's not supposed to. Even when God is giving instruction to Moses, he says, around the base of Mount Sinai, if anyone steps across this line, they will immediately die. And of course, in the Old Testament, there is a lot of death penalty. There's a lot of reasons to put someone to death. First of all, you have to have at least 2 witnesses. So it can't just be Rob accuses me of something, y'all take me out and stone me. There's a lot of reasons to kill people in the book of Exodus. If you kill somebody on purpose or on accident. If you strike, attack, or smite one's parents, or even rebellion against one's parents. Yeah, watch out. Kidnapping, cursing one's parents, witchcraft, divination, worshiping other gods, violating the Sabbath, child sacrifice. I'm not going to read all these things, but defiantly refusing to accept a court's ruling. Say, I refuse to abide by the court's ruling. Could void your life. Giving false testimony, accusing another person of having committed a capital offense. All these. Also, it begets kind of the theological question of just war. When the Abbey was running as a coffee shop, we had a debate one night. I don't know if anybody came, but Lou was there. We had a debate of, is there such thing as just war? Was World War II a just war? Was it just for America to come in? What are the parameters of just war? What does that look like? What are the rules of engagement? I would say looking at Russia invading Ukraine, Russia's trying to make itself, they're trying to make an argument that it's just war. They're saying there are Nazis in charge, even though it's like Jewish president, Jewish government, saying there are Nazis in charge of Ukraine, and Ukraine doesn't really exist. Ukraine is just Russia. And so these Nazis are coming over and inhabiting our land, our country. So we have to liberate it. Now, as Americans, we're looking and saying like, oh my God, there's genocide happening. There is like this atrocity of being attacked. Is it just war for us to go in and fight against the Russians? Is it just war if it leads to nuclear war? Is it just war if we don't go in and it prevents nuclear war? This is like the good theological debate. Over time and through the centuries, there have been different responses. There are popes who said the Crusades are just wars, right? That Jerusalem is overrun by Islam and we have to go and liberate the holy city. And that's a just war. When they were at the first crusade, the Pope said, anything you do in the name of the crusade is justified. So they said, well, how will we know the Christians, as we're marching between here and Jerusalem, how will we know the Christians from the Muslims? The Pope said, we'll kill them all. The Lord knows his own and we'll sort it out. It's like, well, upon reflection, I'm not sure that's like just war. Now we look back at the Crusades as genocide, as all kinds of horrors and atrocities. I guess a lot has to do with perspective. It's complicated. What do you guys think? Is it possible to have just war? It's right to defend yourself. Yeah.
This is just such a struggle for me because, as the death toll rises in Ukraine, we're talking 20, 30,000 people now. Is it right to give one person in power that much power to just wipe out the entire generation? I don't know. It's just really difficult.
You're seeing whole cities being laid to waste. You're seeing tens of thousands of people unnecessarily dying. But you're also seeing Russian soldiers being conscripted, right? The first wave of Russian soldiers were told that they were going to go on a military exercise. So they had 2 days worth of rations. So like they showed up with dress uniforms and 2 days worth of rations and said, you're going to do military exercises and then have a parade. And all of a sudden they're told, and now we want you to kill all these innocent civilians. And they're like, wait, what? What about the Russian citizens who are being conscripted off the streets? What about the Russian soldiers who were forced to sign up because it's a mandatory system? I don't know. It's real. There's great sadness. It's the preciousness of life, that life itself is a gift. As we talk about the death penalty, this is something that again is debated among Christians. Should there be a death penalty? What I find strange in American politics is someone who, if you said, I am classically liberal, that might imply off the top that you're pro-choice and anti-capital punishment. If you're conservative classically, that would mean you're pro-life and pro-death penalty and pro-capital punishment, which are conflicting issues. I think the Roman Catholics have the best systematic theology of anybody, where they say like from, snout to tail, we are pro-life. So we're pro-life from the very beginning of conception. As a matter of fact, the Roman theology of sex is we should only have sex for procreation, because that's the only reason for it to exist, is for life. You only come together in that unifying way if you intend to have a child from that experience. And then everything from that moment on, when those zygotes start to do their dance, from that moment on, life is precious. That's why in the Roman Catholic Church, they're pro-life. That's why they're very pro-education, early education, pro-like maternal health. They're pro-soup kitchen, social convictions, and they're anti-war and anti-death penalty, because they say life itself is precious. I think it's a great systematic theology. I would say it's a terrible and often hurtful practical theology. So for instance, in the 80s, when they were against passing out condoms during the AIDS epidemic in Africa, because they say, well, you shouldn't be having sex anyway. It's like, well, That's not helping stop the spread of that's not helping stop the spread of AIDS. So it's not a practical theology, but it is systematic. And I think what people on the left and people on the right, there's failures is that they don't have a systematic kind of concept of life. So are we going to be pro-life at the beginning, but then have capital punishment on the end where we're taking life? How does that part of the same arc, or I don't know. It becomes complicated, doesn't it? Of course, Jesus takes it to another level. Again, he kind of expands it. It says, but if you have anger in your hearts, you've already committed murder. Which, like, you could say, well, thank God I've never murdered somebody. But who hasn't had anger? But who hasn't experienced anger? That kind of strikes close to home. The greatest threat to the family. What is the greatest threat to the family? Is adultery. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Because what is God's great blessing is life, to go and be fruitful. Why do we have families? It's because somebody comes together and we make a family and we have children. And the threat to that is if you have all of these wanton children. The land itself is passed as inheritance through the nuclear family. And so if you have dozens of children coming from all different women, right, then who gets the land? Now, the one great exception is Jacob, because Jacob has these 12 kids. It's 13 kids altogether, but they become the 12 tribes. And they're from his 2 wives, but also all of their concubines, all of their handmaids and everything. So Jacob gets the grand exception. After that, you really shouldn't have kids outside of marriage, because the promise for your children is land. That's what they get. In the Old Testament worldview, we're not working our way into heaven. Heaven comes to earth when we have children, when you have land, when you have your health. And that, in a sense, is your wealth. But also wealth. If you have lots of sheep and goats, that helps too. Adultery threatens the very building blocks of civilization. The building block, which is the family, right? A married father and mother and their children. Anything that threatens the family unit is prohibited. We see, obviously, lots of bad examples. King David, who is, preeminent among kings. King David, who's the only king to unify the whole kingdom for a very small period of time. But we see him get into all these problems because of Uriah, right? He kills Uriah. He takes Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. Their first child dies. Nathan confronts David. It's not great. When people say, biblical marriage, it's well, there's a lot of bad examples of marriage in the Bible. Biblical marriage. There's a lot of really bad and messed up models. And what people refer to as biblical marriage is really Southern Christian marriage from the 1950s. That's what we're talking about. Because in biblical marriage, King David has 500 wives, and at one point his son sleeps with all of his wives. We see him kill Uriah and take Uriah's wife. We see all kinds of messed up relationships. There's only a few good ones. Even Boaz, Ruth and Boaz, she tricks him into sleeping with her in the middle of the night. And then he goes and gives his shoe to his cousin, and his cousin refuses to take the shoe. And that means they're married now. And that's King David's grandmother. Biblical marriage. We did a Bible study here for almost 2 years on marriage. Maybe not quite that long. But my first year and a half, we did a Bible study continuously on marriage. Do y'all remember that? Saying what is marriage? Well, the threat to it is adultery. It's not necessarily, the family unit's not necessarily about love. It's not necessarily about mutuality. It's not necessarily about sharing responsibilities or going on long dates or enjoying each other's confidences. It's about having children. We get married and we're having kids. Of course, Jesus weighs in on this. The controversies we have now in the church, the controversies we have around gay marriage, man, Jesus, why didn't you weigh in on that? Jesus does weigh in on adultery, right? He says anyone who has lust in their hearts. We're talking about Robert Bentley the other day. So, Robert Bentley got thrown out of office really for having lust in his heart. Robert Bentley, sweet elder statesman Robert Bentley fell in love with a woman who, like, from all the accounts I see, didn't really like reciprocate that love. Like, she never got divorced. She didn't get married to him. Like, he kind of loved her in his heart and was real weird about it, kind of old man weird about it. And then everybody in the media found out, and then he had to resign. It was like, what did he do? He had lust in his heart. And then we got Meemaw K. Ivy because of it. So it all shook out. But then, of course, Jesus meets the woman caught in adultery, which means there was at least two people who caught her in adultery. Now, it's not the man caught in adultery. We don't see a man who's been brought out before Jesus. We see the woman. So a lot of people think this was set up, right? Because, like, in what situation do you just have a bunch of random people walking in, catching a woman in the act? And what does Jesus do? He says, those of you without sin can cast the first stone. He says, woman, your sins are forgiven. Or the woman at the well. He says, I know you've had 7 husbands. As a matter of fact, the person you're sleeping with now is not your husband. And she's like, oh, damn, you think, no, you know me, Jesus. But there's something about that Jesus takes it to another level of both forgiveness, of both mercy, but also justice, right? That we're not meant to carry around that lust in our hearts. That's not the way God intended us to live. Number 8, thou shalt not steal. The threat to our economy, right? Society depends upon the rule of law. And if we're building a new society together of Israel, it depends on us not stealing, of honoring each other's stuff. The Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, translated the Hebrew with the Greek klepto, from which we get the word kleptomaniac. Like the Hebrew ganav, it carries the idea of taking secretly and craftily that which rightfully belongs to another. Embezzlement, misappropriation, serve as good examples of theft. Y'all know the story of All Saints in Homewood? It's like a scandalous story. But like All Saints Chapel caught on fire. I think it's like in the 1980s. The chapel caught on fire. So they raised a bunch of money. They got insurance money. They're going to rebuild. Well, I'm not sure how the story exactly unfolds. Lou, you probably have a better handle on this. But it was like a stripper from Sammy's got in touch with somebody in the diocese to say, I just want you to know this guy's been coming in, spending a lot of cash, that he was taking money from All Saints and going to Sammy's and living his best life. And it was the stripper who's like, this seems immoral.
I want to go to hell and I don't want to live in love.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, man, gosh, the balls on that guy, right? Scandalous. Thou shalt not steal, but embezzlement, that is a big part of it. The word stresses confrontation and the use of violence or threat of harm as the principal means of theft. So thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. Thus, for the Lord, stealing is robbing, looting, plundering, other unlawful seizures. One of the things right now happening in Ukraine, it's like this known thing, is not just the Russian soldiers going in, they're going in and looting and pillaging and stealing. They're saying they're going in as Ukrainians are fleeing, they're going in and just grabbing everything. So this is a violation, right? This is not God's just will. This is from the former United States Supreme Court Justice George Sutherland. Everybody knows George Sutherland. He says, no liberty is possible unless a man is protected in his title to his legal holdings. He said, you can't be free if you can't be protected for your stuff, for the things you own, the property, and can be indemnified by the law for its loss or destruction. Remove this right. Remove the right of being protected and your stuff being protected. And man is reduced to serfdom, right, to slavery. To give man liberty, but to take from him the property, which is the fruit and badge of his liberty, is still to leave him a slave. This is one of the, I'm reading a lot about Russia right now. I'm reading a lot like the history of Russia. And, there's like, Russia is built on serfdom, on kind of enforced slavery, all the way to like the 1917 revolution, right, of communism. But then really through all of communism, where communism just makes everybody a serf. So it just, instead of like removing serfdom, it just makes everyone a ward of the state. And so there's just no more aristocracy. And so the great chaos of the 1990s that led to the rise of Vladimir Putin was they never had a system of a middle class. They had either the aristocratic gentry at the top, the people, titles and lands and the nobles, and everyone below them, or just everyone was broken by the government. And so in part, Vladimir Putin was the first to have something of a not democratic society, but something of a changing of the system. But to say, essentially what he's saying is if your property and the things you own can be seized at any time, then you've been reduced to serfdom, then you've been reduced to slavery. If all of your stuff can just be seized, right, then you're not ever free. It is a thing through world history. And when you Google it, it brings up things of anti-Semitism, but part of Jewish culture where they were known to be bankers and money lenders, because part of the faith of Judaism is that you are meant religiously to not embezzle or to steal, that you have to be trustworthy as a person of faith. What is the greatest threat to the law? You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Gosh, is anybody following the Johnny Depp, Amber Heard trial right now? Do those names ring a bell? Pirates of the Caribbean, hello, 21 Jump Street. Johnny Depp was in this relationship with a woman for like 4 or 5 years. They got married. Turns out it wasn't great. They didn't do premarital counseling, didn't go through the Episcopal Church. It's terrible, right? All kinds of drama. They get divorced, whatever. Like 3 years later, she writes an op-ed for the New York Times and talks about being abused. She doesn't mention Johnny Depp, but he says, hold up. But everybody says, oh, you're talking about Johnny Depp. Now, by the way, she also dated Elon Musk for a year. So her credibility is already on thin ice. So like Johnny Depp says, I'm losing all this work. I can't work because you have said that I physically abused you and assaulted you, and I didn't. So he's suing her for $50 million. So she's countersuing him for $100 million. And we get to sit back and watch the drama. And so they're like playing videos and recordings. And it's like all the worst things. It's like publicly aired dirty laundry that nobody needs to see. And it's really ugly and it's really hateful. And it turns out they're probably both really bad. But it's this public drama. It's this lawsuit, right? And neither one is going to come out well. And neither one's going to walk away and say, now we're all better off for it. A person who had a charge brought against them or brought before religious prosecution, the charge was considered as established only if there are 2 or 3 sworn witnesses. So just because they're like fighting with each other, that doesn't mean anything. You have to have people who are witnessing it, people who are around it, right? But there's a lot of cause for lawsuit in Leviticus. Anybody know? There's a lot against false testimony in Leviticus. For instance, anybody who knows evidence must testify in court, but carefully interrogate the witness. A witness must not serve as a judge in capital crimes. Transgressors must not testify. There's a lot around this. This is the legal system because there's no civil law and religious law. It's all one law. The law is how we live our religious life. What does Jesus say? Even if you're at the temple about to offer sacrifice, and there's a lawsuit against you, stop and go and make it right. Because if there's a lawsuit against you and you're fighting with someone in court, then you can't be fully in a relationship with that person. So stop and make it right so that you can be restored to that person, because you can't be in a full relationship with God if you're not in a full relationship with your neighbors. So the lawsuit takes us out of relationship. People who are, what's the word, Lou, when you're not allowed to take communion? Excommunicated. Excommunicated means you're not allowed to take communion. We have the power to excommunicate you. So watch out. That means you want that sweet, nutritious bread of life. And I say, no, sir. The idea is, coming kind of from this, you are not fit to present yourself before the Lord. So for instance, if there's like a husband and wife who are like in a bad fight and everything's been ripped up, you might say, I don't want you guys to come and receive the Eucharist until you've reconciled and made this right. Or for instance, like my wife, when she was a little girl, she was fighting with her brothers as they were walking to the communion rail, and they got there and they were like bickering with each other at the communion rail, and the priest told them, no, go back to your seats and either try it again or you're not receiving communion. So shape up. Yeah. But the idea that we can't step into the presence of God without being reconciled with each other. Does that make sense? Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. Lawsuits are too easy. There's a big lawsuit that just got settled with Donald Trump and one of his former assistants, and the judge awarded to her $1.3 million. But they said in part it could be, it's more stiff than anyone expected, because they said in part they want to set precedent that it's not okay to have such frivolous lawsuits. You can't just be suing people all the time, constantly. Oh, you said something that hurt my feelings, I'm going to sue you. And you can't have 1,000 lawsuits. So said the judge awarded 1.3 as this really high and stiff punishment to say, in a way, quit suing everybody. Like, this is not how we use our legal system. And that's fair, because like lawsuits are common even in the Episcopal Church, even amongst the brethren and sisterin ourselves, right? The people are quick. You hurt my feelings, I'm going to sue you. So that's not the way God intends. What is the greatest threat to our neighbor? Not just to our nuclear family or to our immediate family, but to our neighbor, is coveting. Right? You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Why? It might kill you for it, right? Make him break another law. It erodes that relationship. That coveting erodes what we have and share between us. The Old Testament, he speaks of a land flowing with milk and honey, the fatlings of the flock, and the other things which indicate that God would have his children properly fed and clothed and sheltered, enjoying the comforts that come of the earth, but not to excess. That God's saying, I will provide for you. I will feed you. I will sustain you. But you're not meant to live in just complete opulence. Yet none of us ever has enough. At least that's what we think. That's what we were talking about earlier. There's this great lie. There's never enough. No matter our financial circumstances, we want to improve them. One of the Boy Scout mottos, does anybody know the full Boy Scout motto? At the very end is to be thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. I saw Carter. Do you know the Boy Scout motto? A scout is? Okay, the Boy Scout saying. Thrifty, brave, clean, reverent. That's right. Thrifty. Thrifty, isn't it? That we're meant to be thrifty, right? That we're supposed to trust and rely on God for our daily bread, both physical and spiritual. The Hebrew word translates for covet, hamad, which is commonly translated in English as covet, is also lust or strong desire. Do not lust after your neighbor's things. Christ admonishes us to desire and store up our treasure in heaven rather than on earth. For where your treasure is, there your heart is also. And Paul wrote, for the love of money is the root of evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. I guess that was the last one. Okay, we made it. We made it with like 4 minutes to spare. So what are your reflections on the 10 Commandments? To love the Lord your God and to love your neighbors yourself.